In the early 1600s, long before the skyscrapers and the glowing skyline, Manhattan was nothing more than a wild stretch of land swept by Atlantic winds, rolling green hills, marshes, dense forests, and the slow current of the Hudson River. Here lived the Lenape people, hunters, fishers, and gatherers, who could never imagine that their peaceful island would one day become the beating heart of the modern world. Then, one misty morning in 1626, a Dutch ship appeared through the fog. On board was Peter Minuit, a representative of the Dutch West India Company. He stepped onto the untouched soil and struck a deal that would echo through history. He purchased the island of Manhattan from the natives for goods worth $24, beads, tools, cloth, and trinkets. A symbolic exchange almost absurd by today's standards, yet it marked the beginning of one of humanity's greatest urban stories. The settlers named their outpost New Amsterdam. They laid crude dirt paths, built wooden palisades, and erected small European-style houses. Their goal wasn't to build a metropolis, just a trading port, a link between the old world and the new. But trade grew fast. Ships crowded the harbor, languages mingled, and the marketplace buzzed with life. From the very first days, commerce was in the city's DNA. New Amsterdam's streets followed no plan. Narrow, twisted, improvised. The town grew like a living organism, unpredictable and wild. Yet hidden in that chaos was raw potential, a restless energy that would shape the centuries ahead. The English seized the colony without a fight and renamed it New York in honor of the Duke of York. Under their rule, the settlement expanded rapidly. New docks, broader streets, sturdier buildings. The port exploded with trade. Grain, fur, sugar, timber. Everything moved through New York's wharves. The southern tip of Manhattan turned into a storm of sails, ropes, and shouting dock workers. The city learned to move with the tide. As decades passed, the population multiplied. Immigrants arrived from everywhere. English merchants, German craftsmen, French refugees, enslaved Africans. New York became a crossroads of humanity, a miniature world in the making. Every new arrival added a brick to its identity, every accent, a note in its growing symphony. And in that diversity lay its first great strength. But growth brought pain. Fires swept through wooden neighborhoods. Diseases spread through overcrowded alleys. The gap between rich merchants and poor laborers widened. Still, New York pressed forward, hungry, impatient, unstoppable. Then came the dawn of a radical idea. In 1811, city planners drafted the Commissioner's Plan, a blueprint that would forever change the island. They decided to cover Manhattan with an immense, perfect grid. Straight avenues running north to south, numbered streets stretching east to west, a geometric order imposed on chaos. It was the first time a city was designed not just to exist, but to grow endlessly. On this blank canvas, New York could now expand forever. Each block became its own little world. Each intersection, a new possibility. And within that relentless order, the American dream found structure, a place where ambition had room to build. The settlers who once bartered for the island couldn't have foreseen it. They didn't know that this swampy strip of land would become the capital of capital, the cultural and financial center of the planet, the place where the world would come chasing its future. New York was born from a gamble, the belief that a muddy island could become an empire. And like so many gambles in American history, this one paid off. Because from its first timber walls and dusty markets, from the shouts of sailors and the clang of hammers on the docks, the city already carried its destiny deep within, the unshakable urge to build bigger, taller, and bolder than ever before.
The 19th century arrived like a storm full of iron, steam, and ambition. Across America, the Industrial Revolution was transforming everything, and nowhere was its impact greater than on Manhattan. In the early 1800s, New York was still a noisy port of muddy streets, horses, and low rooftops, but underneath the soot, a hunger was growing, a hunger to build higher, faster, greater. Then came the immigrants. Irish, Germans, Italians, Jews, millions chasing hope. Every week, ships poured humanity into the city's veins through Castle Garden, and later Ellis Island. Tenements rose like brick hives, packed with noise and life. The island was swelling with people, and since it could not spread outward, it looked upward. Steel changed everything. With the invention of the elevator and the rise of steel-frame construction, gravity was no longer a limit. Architects became visionaries. The Flatiron Building, the Singer Tower, the Woolworth Building, each structure challenged the sky itself. Men worked hundreds of feet above the ground, balanced on narrow beams, hammering the future into shape. Every rivet struck was a heartbeat of the modern world. Below, progress thundered through the streets. The Brooklyn Bridge united boroughs once divided by rivers. Electric lights illuminated nights once ruled by gas lamps. The city pulsed with energy, its rhythm mechanical, industrial, unstoppable. Beneath it all, a second world began to take shape, the subway. In 1904, the first underground line opened, turning chaos into connection. For the first time, all of New York's boroughs could beat together as one living heart. By the 1920s, the transformation was complete. Skyscrapers pierced the clouds, factories hummed, and Times Square blazed with light. Money and ambition coursed through Wall Street like fire in metal veins. But the same forces that made New York powerful also made it fragile. The more it built, the more it risked collapse. The Great Depression loomed on the horizon. Still, in less than a century, the island once traded for beads had become the workshop of the modern world, a forest of steel rooted in stone, always reaching for the heavens. And as the sun set over the Hudson, its reflection on those towers whispered a truth that still defines the city today. In New York, nothing is ever finished. Everything is always under construction.
While New York's skyline clawed its way toward the clouds, another world was being carved deep beneath its streets, a hidden city of tunnels, rails, and echoes. It was the dawn of the 20th century. Above ground, the city roared with the noise of progress, horses, trolleys, horns, and endless crowds. Manhattan was bursting with life, but also choking under its own success. The streets were jammed, the ferries overloaded, the bridges trembling under millions of feet. Something had to give. New York needed space, not on the surface, but below it. In 1900, a small group of engineers and dreamers dared to imagine the impossible, a railway running under the island itself. To many, it sounded like madness, tunneling through granite and beneath rivers, under buildings, gas lines, and sewers. But New York had never been afraid of impossible dreams. The man who turned that dream into reality was William Barclay Parsons, chief engineer of the city's first subway line. Under his leadership, thousands of workers, many of them poor immigrants from Italy and Ireland, labored day and night in the suffocating dark. Pickaxes struck the stone, drills screamed, dynamite thundered. Entire streets shook as the future of the city was carved inch by inch from the bedrock below. The work was brutal. Accidents were common. The pay was low. But the men kept digging, driven by something far greater than themselves, the belief that they were building the veins of a living giant. On October 27, 1904, that giant finally opened its eyes. The first subway line stretched from City Hall to 145th Street, a mere 9 miles, yet a revolution. That evening, 150,000 people crowded the stations, cheering as the trains rumbled into the tunnels for the very first time. The underground city had come alive. For the people of New York, it was more than transportation. It was liberation. The subway united a city divided by distance and class. The banker and the baker, the artist and the immigrant, all shared the same space, the same air, the same journey. Down here, the city forgot who you were. What mattered was where you were going. Within a few short decades, the underground expanded like wildfire. By the 1930s, hundreds of miles of track connected the 5 boroughs. Entire neighborhoods were born around stations. Shops opened near entrances. Children grew up falling asleep to the distant thunder of trains. Every new tunnel was an act of faith, a statement that New York would never stop growing, no matter how crowded or complex it became. When private subway companies merged into one massive system in 1940, the New York subway became a city beneath the city, its own labyrinth of platforms, lights, and ghosts. Over 400 stations and 600 miles of track, an invisible empire humming beneath the feet of millions. To ride it was to experience the city's soul. Each station had its story, mosaics and murals telling silent tales of decades past. Jazz musicians played in the tunnels, preachers shouted above the noise, graffiti artists painted their dreams across the steel walls. The subway was chaotic, unpredictable, sometimes filthy, but always alive. When a train roared through a tunnel, the wind that followed felt ancient, like a whisper from the men who had carved those tunnels with their bare hands. The decades rolled on, and the underground evolved. In the 1970s, the subway fell into darkness. Crime, neglect, and despair turned it into a symbol of urban decay. The walls were scarred with graffiti, the lights flickered, and fear rode with every passenger. But even then, New York's heartbeat never stopped. In the 1990s and 2000s, the city fought back, cleaning stations, restoring art, and bringing order to chaos once again. The grime faded, the music returned. The trains shone under brighter lights, and the tunnels once again echoed with energy instead of fear. Today, over 5 million people ride the New York subway every day. It runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a miracle of endurance. While other cities sleep, New York keeps moving. Nurses returning from night shifts, students chasing dreams, workers heading to early shifts, all carried by the same iron veins beneath the city's skin. Above ground, the skyline continues to rise higher than ever. But below, the subway remains the city's true heartbeat, a reminder that power doesn't always shine in glass and steel. Sometimes it rumbles in the dark. Beneath every skyscraper, under every street and sidewalk, lies a living network that hums with the rhythm of human ambition. The subway is not just a system, it is a soul. And more than a century later, that soul still beats, steady, stubborn, and eternal.
By the mid-20th century, New York had reached its peak. The skyline glittered like a crown of ambition. Wall Street thrived, Harlem sang, Broadway burned with light. The city looked eternal. But beneath the brilliance, cracks had begun to spread. In 1929, the heartbeat of finance stopped. The stock market crashed, and New York was the first to fall. Traders who had once ruled from skyscrapers stood in breadlines below them. Banks collapsed. Families lost everything. The city that had built the tallest buildings in the world suddenly couldn't pay its rent. Yet even in ruin, New York refused to bow. While the rest of the nation froze in despair, the Empire State Building rose, a monument of defiance built in the darkest days of the Great Depression. After World War II, hope returned. Soldiers came home, highways connected boroughs, and suburbs bloomed. Visionaries like Robert Moses rebuilt the city with roads, bridges, and parks. For a while it felt like a golden age, order, growth, optimism. But that progress came at a cost. Whole neighborhoods were destroyed, families displaced, and communities divided by concrete. The very structures meant to connect the city began to tear it apart. By the 1970s, the dream had soured. Factories closed, jobs vanished, and crime exploded. The middle class fled to the suburbs, leaving behind poverty and fear. Graffiti-covered trains became symbols of chaos. In 1975, New York declared bankruptcy. Garbage piled up, lights dimmed, and the once great metropolis seemed on the edge of collapse. But from the ruins came rhythm. In the Bronx, youth with nothing created something. Hip-hop, music born from pain, pride, and survival. Even in darkness, the city kept creating. The 1980s and 1990s brought rebirth. Times Square, once a neon graveyard, came alive again. Investors returned, streets were cleaned, and a new skyline began to rise. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center stood tall, symbols of rebirth and unity after decades of struggle. New York had survived again. Then came September 11, 2001, a day that broke the world's heart. Smoke, dust, silence. The towers fell, but the spirit did not. Amid the rubble, firefighters, doctors, and strangers stood side by side. The courage of that day became the city's foundation. And from the ashes rose one World Trade Center, a new monument of strength, higher, brighter, unbroken. Today, New York remains a paradox, fragile yet unyielding. It falls and rises, burns and rebuilds again and again. Its true strength is not in its skyline, but in its people, millions who arrive with nothing and stay because they believe. Because beneath every block of stone, beneath every story of loss or triumph, one truth endures: New York never dies. It simply builds again. The 21st century dawned with both grief and determination. After the ashes of 9/11, New York faced a choice: mourn what was lost or rebuild what could be. And true to its nature, the city chose the latter. In the years that followed, cranes returned to the skyline. Steel met sunlight once more. From the wound in Lower Manhattan rose One World Trade Center, a tower of glass and light. Not just architecture, but resurrection. It stood 1,776 feet high, a symbolic echo of America's birth, and a reminder that even shattered dreams can rise again. The new century brought a new kind of ambition. New York began to redefine itself, less about power, more about possibility. Less about height, more about harmony. Where factories once stood, now shimmered towers of innovation. Neighborhoods like Hudson Yards, built on air above old rail tracks, became a symbol of the city's evolution, a vertical city within the city, alive with art, business, and glass bridges that seemed to float above the clouds. On the High Line, a forgotten railway turned garden in the sky. People walked where trains once thundered. What was once industrial decay became serenity, a metaphor for what New York does best: turning scars into beauty. Technology reshaped its pulse. From Silicon Alley to Brooklyn's creative hubs, startups, designers, and dreamers built a new frontier of innovation. The city that once led the world in steel and finance now led in data, design, and diversity. Every accent, every idea, every culture found a place in the mix, because New York had learned that greatness is not built by walls, but by windows that let everyone in. Even as storms, pandemics, and crises tested it again, New York endured. The COVID years silenced its streets for a time, a city built on noise suddenly wrapped in quiet. But when the lights came back on, they shone brighter than before. Cafes reopened, laughter returned to Central Park, and subway musicians played again, a softer, prouder song. Now glass towers like One Vanderbilt, Hudson Tower, and the Edge reflect not just ambition, but adaptation. New York no longer builds just to impress, it builds to breathe. Sustainable architecture, green rooftops, and vertical gardens speak of a future that looks upward and inward at once. Yet beyond the skyscrapers, New York's soul remains the same. It's in the smell of bagels at dawn, the sound of a saxophone in the subway, the glow of lights across the East River at night. It's a city that never stops dreaming because it was born from dreams, rebuilt from loss, and renewed by the people who refuse to leave it behind. Every generation rebuilds it in its own image, and somewhere right now, someone is sketching the next tower, the next song, the next dream, that will once again redefine the skyline of the city that never sleeps. New York was never just a place. It was and will always be an idea, the belief that no dream is too big, no fall too deep, and no night too long. From an island traded for trinkets to a skyline that touches the stars, the city has burned, rebuilt, and risen again, each time stronger, brighter, more human. Steel may shape its towers, but people will shape its soul. Every immigrant who stepped off a boat, every worker who swung from a beam, every artist who played on a corner, every voice that echoed through its streets, they built something larger than a city. They built a symbol of endurance. New York never truly rests. Even when the lights dim, its pulse continues in the rum.